Elaine was born in multicultural Hawaii. She developed a long-standing love of Asian art from her Chinese mother, and especially from a summer spending time in Taiwan as a teenager. After her long career in medicine as an ER doctor and then in the public health sector, she was able to retire. She has become a docent at the San Diego Museum of Art. In fact, that's where I met her. She is also an active member of the museum's Asian Arts Council. Besides enjoying Chinese brush painting, she is fascinated by the ongoing study of Asian art and culture. Her fascination will be evident in her presentation today. So let's welcome Dr. Elaine Pierce. Okay, now we can all mute and stop our video.
Well, thank you so much.
Sorry, 请大家静音，请大家静音，请大家把你的摄像头关掉。Thank you, Elaine. I just want to be sure. Okay.
Sure. Okay, are we ready? Just want to thank you all for being here today. This is just such a vibrant international community online. It makes me think about how resilient we are as humans. Our lives have been disrupted, so we created something even better than we could have with a local museum. So today I'm going to talk about a very peculiar, obscure topic. And I'll start to share my slides now so you can see more about it. Okay, so you're seeing my screen, correct?
Yes.
Great. It's obscure because there's hardly anything left of this type of art. So much of it was destroyed, and it's really only been studied in about the last 10 to 15 years or so. And I think you'll find it a fascinating and intriguing topic here. Now, but first, before we get into this, we're going to start in the United States in the late 19th century. So you're a hardworking man, because only men go to a pub like this, and it's been a long day, and you want to go there after work to have a beer. You step inside, and it's very dark, very smoky, lots of pipes and cigars. You sit down, you get served, and as your eyes adjust to the darkness of the room, you notice at the far end of the tavern, there's a duck hanging on the wall. Now, at this time in the 19th century, that wasn't too unusual. After people hunted an animal, you know, they often hung it on the wall before they were ready to prepare that. But it keeps capturing your eye. You can't stop checking it out, and finally you are compelled to walk across the room and feel those downy, soft breast feathers. And to your amazement, it's a flat, hard surface. So what has just happened here? You have seen a trompe-l'oeil painting, which is a French term meaning to fool the eye. And this is a painting in our museum. And when I say our museum, I mean the San Diego Museum of Art, where I'm a docent. And I hope the next time we're able to get into the museum, please stop in the United States galleries and see this work in person, because it is quite remarkable. This was painted in 1883 by William Harnett. And the criteria for a painting that can fool the eye is, first of all, it has to be a non-moving, inanimate object. It needs to be life-size, no cropping of the subject matter, meticulous technique without visible brushstrokes, and a uniform light source. So in the last slide, you saw that the very clever tavern owner installed it with a window on this side so that the shadows would all make sense. Now, I call this the Rodney Dangerfield of painting, and I know that dates me. If you don't know Rodney Dangerfield, he was a comedian in the 1970s, and he always used to grab his tie and say, "I don't get no respect." Well, in some ways, this kind of painting didn't get much respect. Now, it wasn't that it wasn't popular. There were lines outside the taverns where William Harnett had his paintings hung. And in fact, they had to have women's mornings, one morning a week, where women were allowed to go in the tavern to see these works. But the art critics of the day thought that they were just worthless. And it was for three main reasons. One, because There was no imagination used to paint it. The second one is that it seemed dishonest. Why would you try to fool people? It was kind of like loaded dice or a crooked card game. And the third reason was that still life, by which I mean painting inanimate objects, was considered the lowest kind of subject matter. At the top would be religious or historical paintings. Next would be portraits of important people. Next would be landscapes. And at the very bottom would be still life. So poor Mr. Harnett, who had funded his own trip to Germany to study this technique, died a young and broke man, because really no one would pay him for this amazing skill. And what we'll see is that in China at various times, there was also a divergence of opinion on how worthwhile it was to try to paint such illusionistic art that mimicked reality. So during the talk today, we'll think about a few things. First of all, why does illusionistic art grab our attention? And then what was its history in China? And finally, when we get to the man of the hour, the Qianlong emperor, I have to say that Lily C coached me on my pronunciation right before the talk. I'm not sure I can maintain it. So I apologize to all Chinese speakers for my terrible pronunciation. But anyway, we'll see why this emperor found illusionistic art so important. But we're going to stay in the West for a little bit longer. And now we're in the Italian Renaissance. This was painted by Giuliano Bugiardini, whose main claim to fame is that he was a classmate of Michelangelo. This is another painting from SDMA. And here we see every trick in the book to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a flat surface. So let's look at them one at a time, because I'm going to be referring to these throughout the talk. First of all, size constancy. We know the size of a human being, or in this case, an angel. So the Virgin Mary is much larger, so we know that she's closer to us than the angel. And if you look in the far distance, there's some teeny tiny people here that shows us that we're having an immense expanse of view in this painting. Secondly, foreshortening. In the Middle Ages, halos were solid and they were always complete circles. But now in the Renaissance, we see these light ellipses that follow the head position so that they're in the correct orientation of the head. Third is linear perspective. So we see that built structures show us spatial recession as they go back in space. Fourth, chiaroscuro, which is simply Italian for light and shadow. So we know, because all the shadows are on this side, we know that the light source is coming from over here. And finally, atmospheric perspective. So just as in reality, distant hills become pale, indistinct, kind of blue. So we get the feeling of distance from that. Now, as we'll see, some European artists went to China, worked for the emperors. They were quite interested in all but one of these characteristics, one of these strategies for depth. And you can guess which one it was. It was chiaroscuro. They hated chiaroscuro on people because to them, this didn't look like a shadow on the Virgin's face. It looked like half of her face was dirty. So that was right out for the most part until very late in the Qing Dynasty. And we will see how these European artists had to modify what they did for the tastes of their patrons. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that I'm saying that illusionism started in the West. Certainly, illusionistic art had a very, very early beginning in China. However, we have nothing extant to look at. But in written records, there's a description of illusionistic murals all the way back in the Western Han Dynasty, around 2,200 years ago. The oldest paintings that we can see are along the Silk Road in Dunhuang, where the desert conditions, the low humidity allowed these paintings to survive. So here's an example of some celestial musicians. And you can see how they are within niches. And there's a suggestion of recession here where this wall is closer than this wall, and this wall is closer than this wall. So they are within a space. We find that in a lot of religious art, the three-dimensionality is important in many cultures. Why would that be? Well, religious art often tries to allow the viewer to feel like they can commune with an alternative space, a spiritual space, whether it's heaven or hell or some other type of space. So the three-dimensionality of being able to almost walk into that scene is important for a lot of religious art. So this was being made around 500 or so CE. What was being made in the West at that time? Well, the examples we have to look at are mosaics. And in Byzantine mosaics, we don't see much interest in depiction of depth and spatial recession. There's a little bit perhaps of size constancy where we assume she's a lot closer than he is, but usually there's not much as far as environmental depictions of depth. Now, of course, there may have been other art besides mosaics that did not survive that were interested in depth, but at least as far as the mosaics, that was not a principal concern at that time. So let's go to China now and talk about that divergent attitude about realism in art. And for this, I'll have to do some basic, I feel a little embarrassed or timid about discussing Chinese history because I know many of you know it way better than I do, but I'm going to talk about a few basics. So we know that the Emperor Huizong was not only a great art aficionado in the Northern Song Dynasty, but he was also a tremendous artist himself. And this is one of his paintings here. He took a great interest in the artists in his academies and his court art. So he determined what was painted, how it was painted. He devised his own style of calligraphy. And it is recorded that in the Northern Song, he favored the depiction, creation of large illusionistic murals that supposedly made you feel that you could walk right into them. So that was important to him. And as we know, he unfortunately paid more attention to the arts than defending his borders. So in 1127, I believe the Jurchen Jin swept down and conquered this capital. And they hauled him and 3,000 of his court and untold treasures up to the north where everyone died in captivity eventually. And they pretty much burned down all the precious palace treasures that, you know, it would have been an amazing thing to have, but they're mostly gone. One of his sons was not in Kaifeng at the time of the attack, so he managed to escape down to the south where he set up the Southern Song Dynasty, which survived for about 150 years. As you might expect, the art of the Southern Song deals a lot with loss and a grieving of what had been lost. And it developed these scholarly amateur literati started painting. Now, the highest art form for them was poetry and then calligraphy, and painting was third. And you can see how painting was, the brush strokes here are really an extension of their calligraphic skills. They were not interested in making you feel like you were actually looking at a place. This is a poetic and philosophical extension of their work. And they really disdained realistic, colorful, realistic art because that was done by artisans. They were intellectuals. And wall painting was even lower than scroll painting. So you would not have the literati be interested in attempting any kind of mural. Now, speaking of the literati, we want to mention hand scrolls. There's a certain experience of viewing hand scrolls. First of all, it's a precious object in a silk sleeve in a box. You go to take it out, you are preparing your mind to have this experience. You lay it in front of you, opening it from the left and rolling it up from the right. So you're looking at shoulder width portions of it, moving at your own pace through that scene. Now here's a very famous hand scroll at the National Palace Museum, and I have it here fully unfurled. So you can see the height to width ratio. I don't know how long this one is. Some of them are over 30 feet long. And we can see the calligraphy at the front and the colophon at the back. And the subject, the title, is the 10,000 miles of the Yangtze River. So just imagine scrolling through this. It's like you are walking along this beautiful scene. And of course, this is not just a physical journey. We could think of Taoism, the way, a metaphorical journey as well. So here is a close-up of, I think, this section. So you can get an idea of just the masterful brushwork that's being done here. And the other part I wanted to say is that what is typical of Chinese art is what we call moving perspective. So as you are taking this journey along the riverbanks, every scene, there's no one spot that's privileged over any other spot. Every point you look at is the ideal spot to contemplate and to view. That's very different than the West, which is you need to stand right here. This is the spot you need to look from. So we'll see that distinction when we get to the murals that I'm going to talk about. So the Handscroll also incorporates the fourth dimension of time because it is specifically guiding you to look at this through time. So here is the topic of the day, which is pronounced Tongjinghu, and I don't know if I'll be able to maintain that. And that means to cross into or move through scenes that are painted. In the Qing imperial records, they talk about about 100 of these, but only a mere handful remain, and some of them are not accessible to scholars, and few are in original locations. So here we have a rather sad, unrestored Tongjinghu that will show you the basic elements, and it's in the Forbidden City in Beijing. In the front, we have a wooden framing device, almost like you'd see on a stage. It's carved and painted. Behind that, we have another wooden panel, but is it really a wooden panel? If you look more closely, you can see that there's a crack here that extends up the plaster into the wood. So this is a faux wooden panel. We are being taken from the world of reality and gradually into this illusionistic world. Now, originally there would have been doors on both sides. So this door would have been the interior of this building. You see how the poles and the cross beams stop at the edge? This would have been a view to the interior. Here where you see this pile of rocks, this door would have been a cave entrance, and we'll talk about Taoist cave heavens later on. So you're having this beautiful vista that gives you the illusion of space, and then these two ways to penetrate into the scene. So you've been taken from your reality of being in this building to another place. And that was very important spiritually and psychologically for some of these emperors. But here, as opposed to the Handscroll experience, the optimal viewing site is right here. So this is not as effective, and this is not effective. So you'll see that these illusionistic murals have an optimal viewing position. So very basic review of the Qing Dynasty. It was preceded by the Ming Dynasty, a powerful dynasty, and the important contrast is Ming emperors were Han emperors. So the vast majority, well over 90% of Chinese identify with the Han as ethnicity. And so when they were conquered by the Qin, when they were conquered by the Manchurians from the north to become the Qing Dynasty, this was foreign rule. So as you can imagine, there was a very harsh beginning to this dynasty. And in fact, there were 40 years of revolts by Ming loyalists that had to be violently suppressed. And what we have is this phenomenon of a tiny minority that's ruling over this vast Han population. So the Qing both had the desire to preserve their own culture, the Manchurian culture, but they were entranced by elements of Han culture. And we'll see that dichotomy coming up. And this was the last, in 1912, this was the end of Imperial China. And then we had the Republic of China. and then on the mainland, the communist regime. So I just wanted to place that in history for you. The first 4 Qing emperors are here. These 3, they're called the Great Qing. So their cumulative 136-year rule was considered the highest point, both as far as political power and culturally, of the Qing Dynasty. The Kangxi Emperor has been considered by many one of the greatest emperors in the history of China. His greatly favored grandson, who was groomed to be emperor from a young age, was the Qianlong Emperor. And the Yongzhen Emperor was no slouch either, but these 2 shone so brightly that he is not as well known. So we're going to be talking primarily about Qianlong. I think it's Qianlong. Lily C, you've got me thinking about that now. So let's look at the Qianlong Emperor as he wanted to be depicted. 3 portraits he commissioned of himself. Here we see him as a young man with his father, the Yongzhen Emperor, and here they are Taoist scholars. We see them behind this prominent scholar's rock. Their scholars' implements are on the table. This is about philosophizing, understanding the Tao, their place in history, and so on. Here we see him in a very different guise as the ruler on his throne. And here we see him in what looks like a traditional Tibetan Thangka painting as the divine Bodhisattva Manjusri. So he believed that he was an incarnation of the Bodhisattva of wisdom. Now I'll show you a Western depiction of this emperor. We cannot ask him, but I bet if we did, he would say that he hated this depiction. Because again, look at the shadows. You know, he looks kind of haggard, and he probably would have seen this as a sign that he was being depicted so dirty that he left a stain on the chair. This would not be, I mean, you could just compare it to his preferred presentation to the way a Western artist has depicted him. And frankly, a lot of the Western artists, I believe, in subtle and not so subtle ways, depicted foreign rulers as grotesque, because that served the imperialist design to subjugate other cultures as inferior. So, you know, he doesn't look particularly all-powerful and calm here, and I don't know if that was by design or not. Now, these 3 paintings, surprisingly enough, were not painted by a Chinese artist. They were painted by the supremely talented Italian Giuseppe Castiglione, and we will get to him in a moment. So this shows you just how versatile this artist would be. Now, first, I want to talk a little bit more about Qianlong and how he was just so not only intellectually curious, but very playful. He was really big into archaeology. So they dug up and carefully cataloged many of these ancient bronzes. Here we see a Zhou Dynasty bronze wine vessel, or hu. Now, he had 40 different workshops, everything from jade to ivory to bamboo to silk textiles. He could have told his bronze workshop, make me an identical object like this and then patentate it so that it looks centuries old. But he may have done that. In fact, I don't know. But here's another thing he did. He asked his porcelain workshop to make a simulation of an ancient bronze hu. And if we take a closer look, you can see just the brilliance, I mean, the technical brilliance of this glaze that imitates bronze, and he even has them put in, chemically create what looks like the beginning of a verdigris patina, as well as just this meticulous carving into the clay that they did. And here's another playful thing he did. So we know that there's these Tao Tie faces on many of the ancient bronzes, and here's a easier to see example. We don't know exactly what they mean. There's several theories about what they were supposed to signify. Well, look at the Tao Tie face he's placed here. He's even placed these rods that were used for piece mold bronze casting for the originals. But no ancient Taotie ever had slanted eyes like this or S-shaped eyebrows. So again, he is not really trying to fool us. It's a kind of an intellectual conversation. It's like we're in the in crowd. If we know the historical reference, then we are in that in crowd of intellectuals that studies history. And of course, in China, looking to the past was always looking toward perfection. So this is a kind of mind that he had, and his devotion to study and expressing it in new forms of art. Now let's go to Giuseppe Castiglione, who was given the Chinese name of Lang Shining. He was born in Milan, trained in art both in Milan and Genoa, joined the Jesuits as a lay brother in 19, assigned to China in 1715. And the Chinese emperors, they'd had some amateur artists in the Jesuits, and they said, we need a professional artist. Just let him know that he will never leave China. So Castiglione signed up for that, and he worked for all three of the great Qing emperors. He was the leading artist for the Imperial Wish Fulfilling Studio, or Ruiguan, where Chinese, Manchu, and European artists worked side by side. They were exclusively responsible for the Tongjinghu murals, and many artists would work together on these. And they were busy. They were just inundated with projects and paintings and decorative things. He was an architect. They did fountain design. I mean, I imagine it was a very pressured and stressful working environment. And I love what someone said about him who knew him. He was humble and gentle, but full of courage. He received great honors when he died. I can't remember the details, but the Qianlong emperor honored him. So last time I gave this talk, I received a question that I realized I should have addressed. Why were the Jesuits there in the first place? What was in it for them? Their goal was to convert everyone on the planet to Christianity. And remember, this was the age of enlightenment, the 18th century. So it was about science, rationality, organizing, categorizing, understanding, and they were trying to mesh that into their religious practice. So they were not just bringing art there, they were bringing all kinds of scientific innovations to the Chinese emperors: engineering, chemistry, astronomy, navigation, hydraulics, I mean, you name it. They brought all this technology to the emperors. And their feeling was, when the Chinese emperors see our understanding of how the real physical world works, even in our art, they see the observation of how the real world looks. How could they come to any other conclusion than that the Christian God is the one true God? That was their expectation. Now, on the other side of the equation, the Qing emperors were, of course, happy to learn about all this technological and scientific innovations. And they were, they were interested in what foreign people believed, but they certainly had no intention of becoming or promoting Christianity within their domains. So the Jesuits had this vision, and here we can see a Jesuit and supposedly an emperor who are united with this new art of, or improved level of cartography, and they are under the rays of Jesus as Christian brethren. So that never occurred, but at the point we're talking about, the Jesuits didn't know that yet. So they were still working very, very hard to impress the emperors. So this is where I thought I'd take my first pause for questions. And so many of you have a lot of knowledge. If you want to make comments about anything I've discussed, feel free to do that here.
Okay, when I don't see any hands raised yet. However, Sharon Beckus had a question from the chat box. I don't know if Sharon would like to state her question directly, or if she'd prefer that I say it out loud.
No, I don't. I can state it.
Awesome.
Thank you. I have a question about the hand scrolls. Hand scrolls are fascinating to me. The length of them, how long they are, and also the fact of as they're painting each section, I don't know whether they're painting or what kind of medium they're using, but do they have to wait for each section to dry before they go to the next section? And then how long do they have to wait if that's the case?
Good question. Well, this is water-based pigment, so it dries pretty fast.
Okay.
And it may be on either a silk or paper base. And I imagine they would be working along from section to section and letting it dry. One of the reasons I am so interested in art is I was sent to Taiwan when I was 16 for a summer visit to learn Mandarin. I was a complete goof off and managed not to learn anything. But we got to visit the National Palace Museum on that visit, and it just blew my mind. And I still remember seeing an incredibly long display case with one of these hand scrolls and scrutinizing every section of it, because I thought surely they would get tired and get careless somewhere, and there would be some sloppiness in technique. And by God, every part looked perfect. And I don't know if they had multiple artists, working on it. I don't know enough about that process, but they're remarkable constructions.
So was the scroll open all the way at first, so they would just continue, or did they open it section by section?
I would think for the really, really long scrolls, and I'm just guessing, that they would allow it to thoroughly dry and close parts of it and not have a 30-foot long table to work on the whole thing. Although that also would present problems as an artist, right? If you want a uniform vision and you're only seeing a piece of it, then you have to remember what you've created and keep that intention in your mind. It certainly would be easier to be able to scan the whole thing and see where you were and where you're going. So I don't know if they built ultra long tables or if they actually only saw part of it as they were creating it.
Thank you.
Sure.
I can see that the next person who has their hand raised is Heather Zimmerman. If you'd like to unmute.
Yes, hi. I have a question also about the scrolls, and I wanted a clarification on reading them. Do you read them from right to left, which was my understanding, but I thought I heard you say you unscroll it from the left and then move to the right. And the follow-on to that is this universal, and is this the way you would read any Chinese painting or wall mural? Do you start from the right, if that's the case, in every reading of the narrative of this kind of artwork? Could you clarify my understanding of this? Thank you.
Sure. Heather, so it's my understanding, and please correct me anyone if I'm wrong, that you are reading from right to left. So what that means is you open it on the left side, and let's see, let me think. You are unrolling it. Now I have to think about how this works. It's rolled up in one circle. It's not two circles when you start. And you would be opening it on the right side and then coiling, re-rolling it on that right side and unrolling it on the left. Not having handled a lot of hand scrolls, I'm having to visualize it, but you are correct. It is right to left. So you're closing it, re-rolling it on the right as you move left.
Right. So if I approach a painting, for example, also, I should focus my attention to the right side first and then move my eye towards the left. Would that?
I believe so. Now, if you're looking at a wall scroll meant to be seen all at one time, very often it's a vertical composition and there isn't a prominent right to left movement for your eyes. But so a hand scroll is different than that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure.
I can see that there is one more hand raised. Chia, would you like to unmute yourself?
Okay. Yes. Also about this scroll, I just wonder how long it is, because we know in our museum, San Diego Museum of Art, we have this long scroll of the Ming Empress, and that is 90 feet long. It is very long. So I wonder if you know how long is this 10,000 Yangtze River?
I could not find the overall length of it when I looked around. So I was hoping to have that, but I don't know. I mean, you can tell, I mean, the average height of an image would be probably at least this tall. So you could see from the height to width ratio that it is very, very long. But yeah, I don't know. And I know, Xiaowei, the one that you're talking about, because the museum could only, because these works are light sensitive, the museum can only show us a section at a time. And then after a few weeks, they have to roll it to show the next section so that no one area gets too much light exposure.
I believe the hand roll is not something to be displayed like a Western artwork. It is like a book. You open it. When you want to enjoy it, you open it. When after you finish it, you roll it up. So it's never subject to a lot of light exposure.
Right. That's why museums are showing these things not in a way they'd ever be used. So you're exactly right. A scholar would have a bookcase or something with all these boxes of precious hand scrolls. They would be in their silk sleeves. You would take it out to have that experience, and then you put that precious object away so it wouldn't get a lot of light exposure in normal use. Okay, shall we continue?
I do see one more question from Loretta and Tom.
All right.
Unmute. There we are.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Tom Hom.
Hi.
And I'm 93, and I'm as I grow older, still older, I become very appreciative of the Chinese art, especially the way you have presented it, Elaine. And my grandfather came from China in 1884. My father had 12 kids, 9 boys, and I'm number 3. And during this period, our house was decorated with Western and Chinese as we were growing up. And I've never had the opportunity to view the Chinese art, the background, the culture, as well as you have presented it to us today. And I just want to tell you how meaningful that is to us. I have a closet. Throughout the year, so many people, when we visit China, so forth, they'll present us with a scroll. And well, we got them rolled up, maybe about a couple dozen in a closet. And what you presented to us, to me today, I'm going to go see these scrolls. I'm going to open them up and really appreciate them, because there's just so much art in there, the way you described it, that it never occurred to me. I am somewhat of an artist, a Western artist. So I've been painting ever since I was a teenager, and I still paint. But you brought a new, let's say, dimension in art to me, presenting the history of Chinese art. So I just want to share that with you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
By the way, 4 of my daughters gone to Taiwan on that summer trip too, as well.
Oh, really? Yes, that was.
Thank you.
That was a rebellious summer. We American kids did not cooperate, I have to say. Well, thank you, and I hope you do enjoy. You have treasures in your home, and it's nice to take time to really look at them. Well, let's go back to what the Western artists did bring to China, because as we saw way back before, 500 CE, they were already thinking about depth and perspective. But what the Western artists brought was one point or convergent perspective. And here we see an early painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And I want you to note all the orthogonal lines. And we're so used to seeing this kind of depiction, we probably don't even give it a second thought, but all these lines are lining up to a certain point. Can you see them all? They're all going to a certain point. Where do you think that point is? If we line them up visually, they all go to what's called the vanishing point on the horizon. And the science of one-point perspective was figured out by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, who also figured out how to create that giant dome on the cathedral in Florence so that it would not collapse under its own weight. Let's look at an example of one-point perspective done for the Chinese emperors. So this was painted after Castiglione's death, but he was a teacher. So all these techniques were learned from him in large part. First of all, how big is this work of art? And we can see here that it is quite large. So the purpose of these big murals is to fill your visual field. And as in that first rather sad Tongjinghu that I showed you, there is a real frame of wood in front of it. And behind that, there's this faux wooden panel. So we see this kind of stage-like presentation here. And now we can look for the orthogonal lines. So you see how these lines are all converging at a single point. And if you try to visualize where that point is, it is actually right at this urn, this antique bronze, probably bronze urn. And that is right under a painting of the three venerables, luck, prosperity, and longevity. And here we have a poem written by the Qianlong emperor. So let's also look at the people involved. What do you think about how the people are depicted here? To my eye, they look like cut out paper dolls. I mean, this woman here looks like she's painted on the receding sidewall of the room. There are no shadows on their faces or bodies. They cast no shadows. And if we're looking for size constancy, these children are very close to us. These children are way behind this back wall because they're outside playing. And yet they are the same size as these children in the foreground. So you can see that what the Chinese emperors were intrigued by is the whole notion of environmental space, how that is enclosing the figures. But they did not want their depiction of figures messed with in any way, especially women and children. These are not portraits. They're more symbols of a harmonious Confucian household where everyone understands their role and is performing accordingly. So there's this fascinating combination of Western and Eastern aesthetics in these paintings. And I have to show you this really fun Trompe painting that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, painted by the great Charles Willson Peale. And he was a Renaissance man. Besides being an artist, he was a scientist and naturalist. He started museums. He was an archaeologist. He was an art critic. He was pretty influential in politics. He was everything. And he named all his children after famous Renaissance artists, which gave some of them a pretty big complex, actually. This is his painting of his sons, Raphael and Titian Peale. And you'll notice this kind of gimmicky thing he does here, which is so clever. He places the first step as a real step that protrudes into our space. And then there's a real door jamb around this. So how does he make this so effectively look like it's a space going behind this wall? He relies a lot on chiaroscuro, light and shadow. So for example, in Titian's face, we see the shadow of the door jamb on there, and then the rest of his face is in light. We see his knee pop forward and be lit up. We see that Raphael has cast a pretty strong shadow here. Even the paint, these little blobs of oil paint, can you see how there's the tiniest little rim of shadow on the side of them that really gives them dimensionality? So as the museum's website says, even George Washington is believed to have tipped his hat to greet the young men when he first saw this work of art, which I think is such a charming anecdote. And that's part of the fun of trompe l'oeil. It's that initial misperception when you catch it and your mind takes a double take, and there's something that feels funny about it. You're kind of shocked, but it feels kind of funny, kind of delightful. And even if you see it again, you still may be, if you walk by in the corner of your eye, you may still be fooled again after the first time, but eventually you won't be fooled. But there's still the memory of that initial episode. And that's what makes these works so memorable. I think it's the sudden reorientation of the mind that makes them quite delightful. So we're seeing a doorway as a trompe l'oeil painting. Let's compare that with a Chinese example. Now this is a photograph I took from a book photo, so the colors are all washed out. But we see here two doorways, and that's an excellent foil for trompe l'oeil art because you can go through that, right? You can go in and out of that. So it helps to break that picture plane down. We're not seeing the reliance on chiaroscuro here, of course, maybe a little bit here, but no shadows on the figure or her gown. Instead, what is this artist having to rely on to get us to see depth? The main thing this artist is using is linear perspective. So can you see how these lines are all at different angles? And in fact, the vanishing point is outside the painting. So we have to mentally connect the dots, so to speak, to create that vanishing point. It's a little more mental effort on our part. Now, this was created for the Yangzhen Emperor, Qianlong's father, when he was a rather rowdy teenager. And I guess they wanted him to settle down. And this was a full life-size, one of 12 panels of beautiful women. So part of the message is, you know, you need to comport yourself appropriately. And if you are emperor, this is what will be at your disposal. So it's probably pretty effective for this teenager. There is so much to talk about in this image. First of all, as I mentioned, the Manchurian emperors had their own culture, but at the same time, they were enamored and fascinated and lusted after this sensual southern Chinese culture from the Jiangnan region. And we see elements of that here. First of all, a good Confucian wife would not be dawdling at a doorway, letting men see her, or even waiting for her husband. She would be inside taking care of her in-laws and the children and managing the servants and doing some needlework. So we know that this is not a wife, this is a courtesan. And what I found particularly funny was to read in James Cahill's book that this was the equivalent of soft pornography. It was considered shocking to look up a woman's silk sleeve, because at that time, the hand and especially the inner wrist was considered an erotic zone. Now, the courtesans were some of the best educated women in China at that time. And there's this romantic notion of the literati scholar and the courtesan having this very erudite relationship. She would know poetry, calligraphy, painting. She could play a musical instrument. They could have a very intellectual conversation. So you'll notice there are two thresholds here. So this represents where that level of entertainment would occur. And then at the right moment, she would take her gentleman caller through the next threshold. And we see how this curtain kind of echoes her body shape. And here there's just a bit of two stools being shown that this is a room for two people. The other thing about the South is we see these planters of tropical looking plants. So the Qing emperors, they made it a point to get down to the South whenever they could. These were called inspection tours, but they never did inspection tours to Central Asia. That was just for conducting wars. But they got down to southern China quite a bit, and they would float down the rivers, and the local ladies would be brought to them in the evening. And the Suzhou area has always had the reputation for the most beautiful women in China, as well as incredible garden culture, these beautiful, mysterious gardens where you turn the corner and there's another vista, and very sophisticated silk textile industry. So we see elements of all this down here. And so for this young teenage prince, it's not just about you can have any woman you want, but you will be in control. This will be part of your empire, this beautiful, exotic, southern, semi-tropical part of China. That will be yours if you conduct yourself right and become the emperor. So let's go back to his son, the Qianlong emperor, and he had public and private concerns. So what were his public concerns? He built a massive empire, so that required a lot of maintenance. There were a lot of foreigners coming to China, so he had to control their influence. And of course, his most important duty was ensuring the continuity of the dynasty with an heir. His private concerns, he was kind of a spiritual dabbler. So he got involved in different varieties of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. He also appeared to be a very affectionate father. Here he is with some of his many sons. And he was really concerned about planning for a peaceful retirement. As many of us know, after a busy career, you're thinking about what's going to be happening down the road. And he certainly was thinking a lot about that. So let's look first at his public concerns. He was an incredible military commander, and all this area was added during this great Qing period. And I'm a little bit unsure how much of this the Qianlong emperor added himself personally and how much was added by his father and grandfather. But he certainly added most of that through these 10 great military campaigns. So he basically, just about doubled the size of the country. And so there were many conquered peoples of very different cultures that he was now ruling over. This is two views of the same painting, which tells us how terrible color reproduction is on the internet. It's not really a mint green horse, but I wanted you to see the whole painting and a close-up. This is an image of the Kazakhs performing tribute, offering tribute gifts to the Qianlong emperor. And so we see up close, he's depicted a little larger because he's more important. We see the traditional kowtow. This was a way for both sides to save face because in fact, the emperors gave back presents that were worth at least as much as the tributes that they received. So for the subjugated peoples, they could view it more as a trade exchange, whereas the emperor could view it as utter admission of defeat and that they were now part of this dependent part of the Chinese empire. And these were particularly valuable gifts because the Central Asian horses were legendary. They could not breed good horses down in China proper. So this was an important gift. So speaking of tribute animals, I want to show you this big Tongjinghu. Oh, no, I haven't. Before we get to that, let me just talk a bit more about Qianlong as a military commander. Here we see him in his fancy garb, but if you subtract the expensive silk brocade, notice how his uniform is exactly like any Manchu general. The same tasseled helmet with the side panels, shoulder pads, the wrist guards, long jacket, the boots. So here he is hanging on to his Manchurian heritage as rough, tough hunter horsemen from the north. They were very proud of that. But what's new here, first I should tell you, this is a life-size painting. The man and horse are life-size. What's new here is the iconography of a ruler on horseback. And for that, Castiglione brought his European heritage. We can look at a painting from 100 years earlier by Diego Velázquez of the Spanish King Philip III. So we can see that this has become a symbol of the ruler controlling a noble steed as a symbol of controlling the empire. And that was taken to China. But look at the difference. Here we see a lot of chiaroscuro that anchors this horse to the ground. This horse casts no shadow. It looks like he's floating. So how does Castiglione create a sense of depth in this painting? You can't use linear perspective. There are no built structures here. There's some size constancy, these close-up of these plants that are bigger than these trees. But the main thing this artist uses for this painting is atmospheric perspective. So look at how sharp the colors are, so bold and sharp here. Whereas the background, this fades even just on the other side of the horse. So he's fading this out very profoundly until this very background is almost invisible. It almost merges with the color of the sky. And I think that's a good example of how talented artists looked at what's in their toolbox and used what they could based on the subject matter and the preferences of the patron. So now we talk about more tribute animals. This is a 17-foot wide painting. And in the imperial, unlike European palaces, in the Forbidden City, you certainly have grand spaces for public things like entertaining generals or whatever. But the domestic quarters, even for the emperor, are usually fairly small rooms. So a 17-foot wide painting may have been the entire wall or most of a wall in the room. This was painted for Qianlong's eyes alone. This was for him to see and to sit in front and contemplate. So what would he get out of this? First of all, we see him back in his Taoist scholar's outfit. So he's not the military conqueror at this point. And he's looking at these peacocks that are trained. So the handler here is clapping, and these peacocks are bobbing and dancing and opening up their feathers. This is significant because this is most likely a tribute from the Dzungar people. That was another Central European people that were really fierce. They were really hard to conquer. In fact, Qianlong's father, the young Zhen emperor, had failed. So of course, Qianlong had to restore his father's honor, and he just threw, I don't know if it was tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of troops and all the materiel to just crush the Dzungars. They were also along the Silk Route, so it was a very important territory to control. So as he looks, as he contemplates these animals, he's thinking about a very arduous and expensive conquest and his role, his responsibility as the leader of this dynasty. Also, peacocks had a lot of symbolism. The eyes in their feathers were a symbol of the eye, the compassionate eye of the Buddha in Tibetan Buddhism. They supposedly eat snakes, so they were felt to be protective against poisons. And the number of feathers in the caps of the court members were an indicator of rank. Notice how we also have a sense of one-point perspective. It's not true one-point perspective, but we see that, and even this natural cliff wall is very flat. It's planar, isn't it? And it's leading back into that space. Let's see. The Taoist cave heaven. So unfortunately, this is mounted on a white wall. I don't know why the museum did this because it destroys the illusion. This was actually a 7-foot tall doorway with the inside crafted to look like a rough cave hewn out of the rock. There's a notion of the Taoist cave heaven, that you could enter into this and you would pop out in another world. So you can leave the dust of the world, the toil, the conflict, the burdensome necessities of interacting with other humans. You leave all that behind and you're in this Taoist frame of mind where you're one with nature and you're not striving. So you can imagine how attractive that was to him. And there's even the famous legend of the fisherman who sees a low cave in the water and sails his boat inside and comes out into a land that reminds me of Shangri-La. It's beautiful, the people are lovely, there's plenty of food. And after some weeks or months, the fisherman thinks, my gosh, I've got to let my people know about this wonderful place. So he sails his boat back out through the cave, can never find the cave again. So there was this kind of mystique about caves, and you can see how this is a contemplative image for the emperor. And in fact, there's a poem here. Kind of unusual to have a poem on an illusionistic work of art because that destroys the illusion. So it was important for him to contemplate that. And the poem talks about his military conquests and the important young men of his court, how vital they were. And at the end, he says, he's talking about the young men and how they're like the peacocks, they're brilliant and elegant, but he comments on his military ambitions. He says, far from culture and having abandoned my reading, I am ashamed of the ambitions that I cherished. Now that is nothing you put in a hall where you have generals banqueting, right? This is for his eyes alone. And it's about restoring the balance, the yin-yang balance, the militant and pacifist. Let's see, it's called To Rebalance His Militancy or Wu with its complementary opposite culture or Wen. So he's well aware of the complexity of being a human in this role that he was thrust into. I think I'm taking too long, so let me try and speed up here. His personal legacy, of course, imperial sons were important for the dynasty, and also they had to perform the right rituals after his death to get him to where his soul needed to be. And the sons were the most important people. Everyone contributed to those ritual observances, but the sons had the most influence. But unfortunately, 13 out of 17 of his sons died, including his intended heir, Yonglian, and as well his beloved Empress Zhaojian died young. And even 40 years after her death, he was writing poetry to her. So his successor was this young man, Yongyan, who became the Jiaqing emperor. And here he confirms his interest in not just looking at the past, the glorious past, but his future, what he's contributing to the lineage of this dynasty. And this is just an amazing, again, life-size painting. And we have a view to the distant background through two levels in this two-story painting. We see the sharp foreshortening, and there is directional lighting here, which so convincingly gives us the shallow carving of these areas. And let's have a closer look at the people in the painting. Here we see one of his consorts, the mother of Yongyan, and she is a good Confucian woman. We're not looking up her sleeves, for goodness sake. She's not meeting our eyes. Her concern is about her child. She's perhaps restraining a little over-exuberant because he's so young. She's starting to train him. She's in this beautiful silk gown with the longevity symbols on the shoulders. She has this gorgeous kingfisher feather headdress. And at the San Diego Museum of Art, we used to have a kingfisher headdress on view. So these beautiful iridescent feathers with gems and pearls that all have symbolic meaning. And the plants behind them each echo their forms. So the long, slender forms, and also symbolically. Bamboo is hollow, it's receptive, it's flexible, it's durable. And rather comically, with this really round head, we have this fat peony, which is the royal flower of virtue. So each person is symbolized by a plant motif. Now we are invited to think of this as a space beyond this wall, and then another space beyond this wall. So let's look at another example of that from our museum. Whenever you're trying to create depth, you want the top of the wall to be clear. We need to know that that wall has depth. So here the Christ child is standing on the wall. There's a little knothole. We see some fingers on the wall. And here is a cast shadow. And I would bet they had to ask the emperor's permission for his son to be depicted casting a shadow. But it's so important here. From what we can tell, the Qianlong emperor was affectionate, sentimental with his family. And I think this is almost like a snapshot. You know, the child's young enough to go, "Daddy!" But this child would rapidly being trained to be future emperor material, which would be very restrained, very, acting according to protocol. So this is a moment in time when that childlike connection could still occur. Okay, so finally, we're getting to his retirement. He had announced as an act of filial piety to his grandfather, the great Kangxi emperor that ruled for 61 years, that he would not rule longer than him. So he would retire at 60 years of reign. And in fact, he lived for an additional 3 years and micromanaged his son. So he didn't really retire, but officially he did. So he had plenty of time to plan for his retirement. And he took this corner of the Forbidden City as his compound. And as he envisioned himself as a scholarly literatus, he supposedly wrote over 40,000 poems, which makes me think he had an army of ghostwriters, but he was a prolific poet. Here we see him pondering his next work, brush in hand, paper at the ready, his scholar's implements. That's how he envisioned his retirement. We're going to look at the inside of a building right back here in this corner next. So this is the amusingly named Studio of Exhaustion from Diligent Service. I think we know who named it. And inside we see a simulated bamboo moon gate. This is really hardwood that's decorated to look like bamboo. And we look all the way to the opposite side of the room and it appears that there's an identical gate. And if we get closer to that, we can see this scene. This is not another bamboo gate. This is a painted faux bamboo gate. And of course, Beijing is cold in the winter, right? So here we are again looking at that wonderful tropical southern Chinese region with the blue skies and the peonies, the cranes for longevity. And the magpies were a certain symbol for the Qing rulers. According to legend, the first Qing emperor, Shunzi, was about to make a bad military decision when a magpie dropped something on his head, and he changed his mind and it saved the day. So this is a specific dynastic symbol that's being portrayed here. So this is a small stage, and this is a niche where his throne would be in that niche. Let's go to a view from just in front of the throne. Qianlong loved theater. He had thousands of theater performers. He had grand multi-level stages, trapezes. Some were big enough for elephants to walk through. But this is a very intimate theater. And it looks like there's a second level, maybe for musicians here, doors to backstage. And look at the ceiling. This is an additional faux painted ceiling, a continuation of the wisteria blossoms that you may have noticed hanging down the wall, but here they are overhead on a simulated bamboo lattice. And like all of these illusionistic paintings, there's one perfect place to stand, and it's right under this one. So you can see how the others all look like they are further away. Let's look at the Western tradition of illusionistic ceilings. In St. Ignatius Church in Rome, we see this faux cupola. This is actually a perfectly flat surface, but if you're standing on the right point in the church, which is marked on the floor, you get this illusion of this big dome and even this little lit up area at the very top. Now this is called quadratura, or illusionistic architectural interiors, and it was painted by Andrea Pozzo. We see a self-portrait here. Now, Andrea Pozzo taught Filippo Abbiati, and it is possible that Abbiati taught Castiglione. So he may have indirectly influenced him, but even if that was not the case, Pozzo wrote an extremely influential book that was translated in many languages, and much of it is online. So I encourage you to look that up because the illustrations are spectacular, both artistically and mathematically and geometrically. It was just, the whole thing is just this whole how-to manual that is exquisite. So we have to remember he was a Jesuit brother. And so this is not, he's not just pointing up saying, hey, look at the fancy ceiling I painted. He wants us to look up at the ceiling because that's looking at heaven and that is looking towards God. And in fact, to quote him, he said, approach linear perspective with a resolution to draw all lines thereof to the true point, i.e. vanishing point, the glory of God. So right next to this ceiling in the same church, Pozzo painted this incredible work. Now, first of all, let me orient you. This is a real archway. This is the real doorway into the space. The ceiling follows this archway. So it's a barrel vaulted ceiling, like the interior of a barrel, right? So on this curved surface, if you stand in the right point, you have the illusion of all these straight columns. Can you imagine painting that illusion on a curved surface? And it explodes the top of the ceiling so that we were looking directly into heaven. And the vanishing point of all these orthogonals lead right to Jesus with the cross. And Jesus is transmitting through light to St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order. So this is the kind of amazing work that was being done in Italy. So we might ask the question, was Giuseppe Castiglione doing any quadratura in China? And in fact, he did. Unfortunately, both those churches are no longer extant, but he decorated 2 Jesuit churches in Beijing. And a contemporary, the Jesuit architect named Moji said, the vaults are beautifully painted by Castiglione. The best painting is that of the cupola, painted on a flat canvas. To the eye, it has the effect of height and depth, thanks to the skillfully created effects of light and shadow. So as you might imagine, the math is pretty complicated. So this projective geometry was first described by Girard de Rargue. So this was something you would have to learn from a master, and this skill would be passed on, and it was passed on to several Chinese artists by Castiglione. Last subject here, Yuan Mingyuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness. This is an 800-acre recreational site that's about 15 miles northwest of the Forbidden City. Most of it is Chinese style gardens, but there's one little area here, right here. This corridor is known, it can be translated as European mansions or European palaces. So Castiglione was the architect, and he had a range of kind of miniaturized palaces so that Qianlong could see the different types of architecture. Some of them look like Baroque churches, some of them look like Versailles. There was a whole variety of things. And this is where the emperors came to chill out and get away from the cares of the world. At the very end, well, let me tell you about that next. So there's an interesting story about this place. This is what exists now of the European palaces. And as we know, in the 19th century, the Western powers ganged up on China. The British forced them to import opium. And when they resisted because they didn't want to make their people addicts, they started bringing their gunboats up the river and blowing things away. So at one point, I think around the 1860s, the British sent a negotiating party. Now, I don't know how much of a negotiation it is when the backup is that we'll just blast your cities away. But this small negotiating party went to the emperor, who unfortunately ordered everyone in that party to be tortured to death. The word of this got back to the British commander, who's Lord Elgin, who's the father of the Lord Elgin, who took the Parthenon marbles to the British Museum, which the Greeks are still unhappy about. But anyway, the father was a British commander, and he said, we are going to punish China for that. And so what they did was they utterly destroyed, just destroyed it. It took several thousand men, almost a week, to demolish this. There were treasures that were even grander than the Forbidden City. There were these enormous, ornate, solid gold things that weighed hundreds of pounds. There were acres of silk tapestries that were thrown on bonfires, all kinds of jade, and there were fancy automatons that did amazing things. And so that's why this great cultural heritage was lost for posterity. Now, the funny part is, this is the original site. You can go 1,000 miles south to Hangzhou and see a full-scale replica of the European palaces, because many engravings were made of them. They know what they look like. And you can see the similarity here. See this doorway and then this S-shaped curve here? You see the same thing here with this same S-shape. And the caretakers of this site think that this is just a tawdry, ridiculous, Disneyland-like recreation, where the people that run this site say, what are you talking about? We're connecting the Chinese to their heritage and their history. So there's a very different attitude about the value of reproducing it like this. But the last slide I want to show you is, you see this long pond here and how you would have a great vantage point all the way down. At the end of this pond was a huge wall at the edge of this compound. So let's see what that would have looked like. So of course it no longer exists, but here's that pond. You can see the trees, so you get the scale of this place. Here on this wall that was over 3 stories tall was an enormous Tongjinghu. And you can imagine it was in brilliant colors, and we're seeing 1-point perspective. I'm sure there was atmospheric perspective. There were these 2 freestanding, elegant structures that again kind of form the curtains of a stage, so to speak. And this was a way for the emperors, Qianlong in particular, to get away from it all. He could imagine that he was in some Italian hill country, looking at this Western architecture, sailing in a boat with his concubines. So you think about this man who was incredibly powerful, the burdens of that power, and how he created this little walled in fantasy world to just help him survive the stresses of rulership. I think it's kind of a poignant a note on someone that you would think, you know, why would we have any sympathy for him? He could do whatever he wanted with millions of people. But that's the flip side of having that responsibility. So in conclusion, I think we can look at both the micro and macro levels of meaning of this. And as we talked about, this shows the human side of Qianlong and how the Tongjinghu served to help him find his balance, feel connected with his family, and have some escapist hours of simple, uncomplicated pleasure. On the macro level, this period of the Great Qing was a collision between two cultures that obviously had very different values and worldviews. It was a rare time of political equipoise when both sides had the motivation to learn from one another and to change. Now that cooperation masked a certain unresolvable differences that would show up later, but for the Middle Kingdom, this was the greatest acknowledgement to date of impending globalization that would soon follow. So I'll just show you, if you can see this book, this was a major source for me. It's a wonderful book written by Christina Kluchen in 2015. And I didn't mention, but that whole area I showed you of the studio of exhaustion from diligent service, that thing had been neglected for well over 100 years. I mean, everything but the ceiling had collapsed, and there was mounds of dust and everything had fallen down. A big multi-million-dollar restoration was done, I think in 2008 of that. And there are two videos on this. Elizabeth is going to give you the links in the chat. And it's a wonderful story. This is a full-length documentary. They had to search for the, one remaining family that still knew how to do that silk brocade and that technique. And then the family had to do it over and over and over and over and get it inspected. And every family, for all the different things, woodworking and everything, was so proud and honored to be part of this historic project. So this video shows you that whole journey, and it's quite fascinating. So I hope you get a chance to look at that. So I am finally done. I've gone way over time. So I'd like to open it up for questions and comments.
I want to thank Dr. Elaine Pierce for her excellent presentation. Indeed, it was so fascinating that I'm sure Professor Yu Chunming would be excited to discuss her content. It also gives me great honor to invite Professor Yu Chunming to be a commentator for today's presentation. 刚刚 Elaine Pierce 所提的内容，我相信于春明教授也都看得很清楚了。现在给我们一个机会来谢谢 Dr. Elaine Pierce， 同时邀请于春明于教授来跟我们说一下。在邀请于春明教授之前，我们非常简单的介绍一下于教授的背景。于教授是出生在中国，然后在著名的过去叫做浙江美院，后来叫做中国美院，在杭州边上这个美院毕业的，然后遍走江湖作画，将中国的民居各类的民居都在他的画笔下留下了影子，同时他也热爱收集各类的瓷器，所以画瓷都是他的专业。I want to just give you a short background about Professor Yu Chunming, who went to actually the world famous Chinese Academy of Arts. It used to be called the Zhejiang Academy of Arts. After his graduation, he traveled for 10 years around all corners of China, capturing the beauties of people's residences and those paintings are now his prized possession. He is also a collector of Chinese cultural pieces, focusing on China porcelain. So we like to invite him to comment about today's presentation. 现在我们请于教授开始跟我们做讲评。
嗨，大家好。非常感谢一类皮尔斯博士的演讲啊，这是一个非常非常有意思的一个内容啊，因为它牵涉到一个东西方文化和东西方美术的交流。我也谈不上演讲，因为我英语不好，基本上不太听得懂。我只是就这个问题做我的就是一些补充吧。我想讲的主要是3个方面。第一个方面是一类皮尔斯那个博士讲了的那个透视问题。第二个是光，因为西方人用光，中国人不用光。第3个是影响，西方绘画对中国的影响。
Okay, I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation, Dr. Elaine Pierce. I have very limited English understanding, so I will try to make some comments and provide some additional information based on what I know about Chinese painting. Her presentation is indeed an interaction between the East and the West, and is also an exchange of cultures. What I want to talk about, I will focus on 3 points. The first point is the idea of illusions. The second point is the use of light or lighting. The third is the impact of Western influence on Chinese painting and vice versa. 好。
透视方面呢，我们知道的中国跟西方的透视截然不同。西方人是一点透视，站在一个位置看这个对方的，看自然的风景。中国是移动闪点透视，叫做闪点透视。体现的最明显的在园林上面。西方的园林，你站在一个位置上面，能够看到不同的景观跟层次。中国的园林，你必须要走动、移动视景，就是你移动的时候，景致就在变化，你在移动中观赏这个园林。这种透视的观念呢，在西方的绘画上面，跟中国的绘画上面，他们两者对立实际上是一个对立的。但是呢，西方的绘画家到了中国的宫廷，他们究竟影响了中国没有呢？影响了多少呢？我想聊一下这个。
So I would say that there are actually 2 opposing perspectives. The Western perspective is a single point perspective. The Chinese perspective is a moving perspective. So if you look at the Chinese painting and look at the Chinese painting of gardens and sceneries, you are talking about moving perspectives. You move and you look and you keep moving and you keep looking. The Western perspective is you look at a single point and you eventually look at a focus, even to a distance. That is a focus, single point. So were there influences by the Western artists into the Chinese palatial paintings? Were there some tremendous, clear evidences of such exchanges? I would like to talk about it.
刚刚一类皮尔斯博士讲的郎世宁，这是一个把透视带到中国的一个画家。他是1715年到中国，然后在中国的宫廷里面国画。1715年的时候是康熙时期，他在康熙时期待了7年，这段时间他没有绘画，现在没看到这段时间他的绘画。到1722年雍正的元年，雍正第1年的时候有他的绘画。到了1727年，有一个人叫做年希尧，这个人呢，他跟郎世宁学透视， 然后呢，把透视翻译成那中文，叫做视学。这本书开始在中国产生了影响。
So, a fantastic artist from the West, known as Giuseppe Castiglione. He went to China in 1715 during the time of the Kangxi Emperor. In that period, from 1715 to 1722, 7 years, we have no evidence of his painting anywhere. But in 1722, during the reign of the Yongzheng Emperor, his painting was first being known. And during that period, he began to paint. In 1727, he had a student by the name of Nian Xiyao. This gentleman was his student and also wrote a book. This book is called the Book of Illusions or the Book of Optics. This would be considered the first time such a term or such a concept appeared in the Chinese history of arts.
我们先来看一下那个中国的散点透视在绘画上的表现，然后看一下它是怎么样变化过来的。这个先看一下这个宋代的绘画，因为画房子、画建筑、画城市、街道是比较容易体现透视的。你像这个《清明上河图》，它这个现在看到的这个《清明上河图》是《清明上河图》那张画的中间的一段，我们看到它是俯视的，然后从左边向右边一个，好像我们的如果是按照焦点透视的话，我们的焦点应该是在右边的一个点上面。那我们再看下一张。
等一下。So, hold on. Yeah. So, if you look at this painting from the Song Dynasty, this is a piece of the painting depicting the lifestyles of the Song Dynasty people along the bank of a river. As you can see, you go from the left to the right, and the focus is a moving focus, and also it's a downward focus, and the focus actually, you have a point, actually a point to the right. 好。
那这个是到了就是旁这一边的那个，就是这张画的右边到了一个角上，我们看到这张画的透视又是向另外一边的透视，向左边的一个透视，然后再看下一个。
Okay, so if you look at this painting, you go from the right corner and you look at the left, you can see the kind of illusions and you can also see the perspective.
这个城门是到城外面的，就是在这张画的最左边的最偏的地方。按照西方的焦点透视，这个城门就基本上你只看得到一个正面，侧面就看不到了。但是现在的这张画的这个城门的透视跟中间的那个建筑的透视，它是一样的。
So if you look at this painting, if you look through it, you can see the face of the city gate. And this face, if you look from the left and you also look from the right, you would be able to see pretty much a full view.
实际上，作者是在表现他走在这个城市的任何一个点上面，然后来看这个城市，然后把它画下来。它是移动的不同的点，它有很多的点，但是这些点也不是严格的按照西方透视找得到它停留的点的，是找不到的，它是随意的画的，随机的画的。
So the major difference in this type of painting is that from the West is that you can see moving perspectives all along. The artists try to show you different perspectives, different points. And indeed, actually, the artist wasn't trying to give you a focus or a single point.
对，我们看下一章。然后我们到了明代，我们来看这个宣德皇帝行乐图，它这个门，这个架子，这个门，按道理来说，它应该是就是有透视的。可是这一张呢，它的正面的这个横杠它是水平的，可是呢，这个3根斜撑的棍子，它却是侧面的。所以按照西方的透视关系来说，它这个也是不对的。
So if you look at this painting from the Ming Dynasty during the era of Xuande, you can see a gate, and you can see the gate, the 2 parallel bars are parallel indeed. But if you look down at the 3 pots as like a tripod, you can see this would not be considered suitable for the Western artists.
对，我们看下一章。对，你看这个是宣德皇帝行乐图，你看它的围墙在不同的面的画法，它向不同的地方透视，它根本不是有固定视点的。
So you can now see a better view of the Xuande's picture, 行乐图, meaning enjoy your day. So if you look at the walls, you can see there is no focus. These are all moving walls, moving parts.
对，我们看下一章。对，有一个大臣把其他的几个官员请到家里来，然后呢，他们后来就画了一张叫《信源雅集图》。你看的这张《信源雅集图》的凳子跟桌子，这个透视是很有意思的。它随意的朝着它的不同的方向，它根本就没有管视点问题。
So if you look at this picture is a gathering of the scholars or literatis. And if you look carefully at the chairs and tables, you will find that chairs and tables were randomly placed on the paintings, and there is no single point.
对，我们看下一章。对，但是呢，因为我们知道，西方人是1498年绕过了好望角，1517年他们就到了中国，是葡萄牙人到了中国。到了中国以后，他们想要跟中国进行贸易，当时被拒绝了。可是1552年，经过那个利玛窦的努力，他们已经就成功了。皇帝批准他们在澳门居住，所以1552年开始，他们跟西方人开始跟中国人进行各方面的贸易，从而他们到了雍正的时候，已经过去200年了。
So, if you look at the history of the Western influence to China, you would look into the Portuguese history. In that, in 1517, the Portuguese landed in Macau. And in 1552, the famous Matteo Ricci arrived in Macau. So by the time we get to the Qing Dynasty, the Portuguese had already been in China for several hundred years.
这200年里面，他们跟中国进行贸易。在贸易的过程中，改变了中国的很多。首先，第一个颜色比较花了，就是颜色多了。以前的中国人画画，他们不喜欢颜色多的东西，他们喜欢单色的水墨的东西。再一个就是透视已经有一点点概念了。你像现在这一张画是民间的，就是安徽那一带的版画《西厢记》。西厢记的第1集那个经验，就是说这个书生第一次看到崔莺莺，那这个景色我们看到它的透视感觉，好像就有一个有一点点那个透视的一个概念，虽然不太准，但他们已经有透视概念。
So the interactions between the Westerners and the Chinese indeed had some impact in the various forms of life and arts, including colors. In the past, the Chinese scholars, artists focused on the use of the brush and the ink. But then, after 200 years of interactions and trade and exchanges, colors became part of the Chinese painting. And also, you can see from this painting, from the Anhui area, it depicts a scene of the Chinese famous love story, Romance of the Western Chamber. And this painting depicts the meeting of Zhang Sheng, the main character, and the little lady, Cui Yingying. And so this, you can see some illusions in this painting.
对，我们看下一张，这个就是当时就是明代跟清代过渡的那个阶段的一个西厢记的一个瓷器，而他们这个瓷器上面的许多图呢，都是从版画上来的，所以呢，他们上面的透视呢，就开始有了这个好像有一定的参照，有这个感觉了，它不是有太乱。 但是他们还不是直接的懂得透视是什么样子。
So this gives you a glimpse of a piece of porcelain, and this porcelain also is about the romance of the Western Chamber. The artist probably copied from the flat painting, two-dimensional painting, into a plate, a piece of china, and you can see. They didn't probably have a lot of understanding of illusions, but you could see a glimpse of it already in this piece of china.
对，我们看下一张。你看这一张是康熙时期的一张版画《空城计》一张瓷器，是青花瓷器《空城计》。这个司马懿他的马那个落脚点在那个城墙角的后面。 可是马头呢，却到城墙角的前面来了。这个加上前面的这一部分的高度，明显的觉得不对，因为那个距离按照透视的感觉，但那个马头根本到不了前面，所以这个透视就有问题了。
So if you look at this piece of china, it's a white and blue china from the Kangxi Empress era. You could see this horse, which is absolutely not logical. The horse's head and the front hood looked just not logical. However, this was a piece of a very precious porcelain depicting a famous story regarding the strategy of the empty city.
而且这个马和这个人比城门还要高，人根本就走不过去，再加上下面的那个 城门里面的那条路，那个透视网就不对了，那个感觉。
Yeah, you can see it's not quite logical to see the horse being so big and the gate is rather small, and the steps leading up also looked absolutely not quite logical.
对，我们看下一张。 这张是个五彩的，五彩来讲呢，当时呢青花特别多，五彩是到后来有外销的时候就开始有五彩了，所以我感觉这张应该是比前面那一张呢要晚，就是这个瓷器做的比前面的要厚一点，要晚一点。你看他就注意了一点透视问题了，他的马的这个人马就往前面画了，就没有放到那个城门的后面去。
So if you look at this plate, this china, you can see this porcelain was probably made after the one that I just showed you, because the proportions are a little better. If you look at the horses, you can see the horses is more in proportion. They're more in proportion with the gate.
所以我觉得这段时间他们有透视的概念，因为跟西方人接触的比较多。 而且西方人要买他们的东西他们对所买的东西会提一些要求，他们有透视的概念，但是他们还不懂透视。
So, due to the needs for trade, and also the Westerners' views were different from the Chinese views, the artisans had to adapt more into a more illusional type of painting and arts. However, they truly did not understand the Western perspectives.
对，我们看下一张，这个也是它的场面特别大。它开始这个肯定是外销的，这个就肯定到了就是1780年以后，就是比较晚了。可能都是就是1800年，也不是1700年左右，1680年以后，1680年以后，有可能都是1700年以后的，因为这个是销往西方的一个杜松子酒的酒瓶，所以这一定是外销的。但这么大的一个场面，他们的透视关系就开始有一点感觉了。
Yeah, this pair of wine vessels definitely were shipped to foreign countries from China. And you can see the complexities of the drawings. And you could also see this is around between 1680 and 1700. And you can see glimpses of the ideology of illusions from the Western perspective, because these were shipped to Western countries.
对，我们再看后边的，这个到了雍正的12美女图，你看它这个透视就比较好了，就不输于西方了。
If you look at this painting, it was painted during the Yongzheng dynasty, Qing Dynasty, Yongzheng Emperor. You can see more. You can see through this young lady into the back of her chamber.
对，因为那个年希尧是督陶官，就是管陶瓷的，给皇帝做陶瓷的，所以督陶官他翻译了《世学》这本书，然后他又把这个透视交给了做陶瓷的工人，那些艺术家，所以呢，在瓷器上的透视就慢慢的越来越好。
So I mentioned before the painter, Nian Gengyao, he was at the time asked by the emperor to be in charge of the making of ceramics. And so he gave the concept of the Western style illusions and single focus to the making of ceramics. And this could be seen also in the products of Chinese porcelain.
对，我们看下面，对这些东西的比例、透视的角度都比较讲究了一点。
Now you can see this plate, and you can see the proportions. You can also see the distance, and you can see the focus. So this is much better.
对，你看我们到了乾隆的时候，中国的瓷器上面画了很多西方的建筑，画了很多海船等等，画了很复杂的一些透视，他们都包括画西方的版画都没有问题，他们就在民间的艺术家里面就透视就比较熟悉了。
When we went to the Qianlong Emperor, artisans began to paint buildings, sailboats, and different types of illusions, and they were actually quite popular, and even folk artists were doing illusions in their work.
对，我们随便看几张那个乾隆的瓷器，往后面放一下。
So we're going to show you a few pieces made during the Qianlong Emperor.
再看后面。
Next one.
这个是西方的荷兰路德教的一个版画，耶稣受难，他拿着中国来画瓷器。
Okay, so this painting was originated in the Netherlands, and it was talking about Jesus Christ on the cross. But this was also brought over to China for them to make porcelain China.
我们看后面， 透视都注意的很好，唯一的就是耶稣像中国人。
So if you look, the illusions and perspectives were pretty good, except Jesus looked like a Chinese.
再看后面，对，这13行的大碗，这很复杂的一个街道，他们都可以画出来。
So if you look at this, 13行 is a famous Chinese company called 13行, and this is a huge bowl, and around this huge bowl, you can see the proportions, the buildings, and you can see the illusions, and three-dimensional work was evident.
郎世宁在中国宫廷教了10几个中国画家，包括丁冠鹏、冷梅、王坚、王幼学、沈园、焦秉珍这些人，都是很有名的中国画家，在宫廷给皇帝画画的，都跟他学画，而且跟他学油画。所以呢，从前面我们看到透视学影响到了中国的民间，从宫廷呢，这些人跟那个郎世宁学画呢，我们可以看到透视学影响到了中国宫廷，但是中间的文人士大夫这一块影响不大。
So we mentioned Giuseppe Castiglione. He had taken many students, including Ding, Wang, Shen Jiao, etc. They were influenced by him. And they also learned oil painting from him. So the impact for the palatial art or arts was evident. But the people, the scholars, and the literati groups might not have been heavily influenced by him.
对，我们看下面一张，他们无论是画哪一种感觉东西，包括这个版画，你们看上去都像是西方人画，不像中国人画的，画得非常好，这是郎世宁的。
So you look at this painting, do you think it was painted by the Chinese? Or this painting was done by some Westerners, and this painting actually was created by Giuseppe Castiglione.
这张画是郎世宁跟其他几个画家合作的。
In fact, many other artists joined him in this effort.
对，我们看下面一张。
Next.
好，这里我们就大概讲完了一个透视问题。透视问题总结起来就是影响到了民间和中国宫廷，没有影响到中间的文人士大夫这一块。另外一个问题就是西方的用光。
So the next part I would like to talk about is the use of light or lighting.
西方人用光主要是代表神，然后它主要是从上面来的，特别是右上角，左上角45度光，那人就会出现一个阴影。
So from the Western perspectives, light comes from God, light comes from heaven, from up to down. It is from the upper left corner downward.
中国绘画是平面的，没有光的。这个是宋代的那个周敦颐的画像。
This painting that you're seeing is from the Song Dynasty, Zhou Dunyi, and you can see it's flat.
这张画像应该是宋代的画，但是呢，这张本身有可能是明代仿的。
Although the original painting was done in the Song Dynasty, it's possible this painting is a copy of in the Ming Dynasty for the Song Dynasty painting.
我们看到他鼻子上有一点点阴影，然后衣服上面的皱褶只是几根线。
So you see the wrinkles on his robe, there are a few threads, and you see the sides of his nose, above the nostrils, a little bit of shadow.
但这是中国人最推崇的一种用光的画像的方式。
This type of painting is considered by Chinese artists as the most effective and most admired.
所以郎世宁到了中国宫廷以后，他画出来的那个画像，如果是有阴影的话，被画的主人是不会喜欢的。 他画了很多的皇帝像、妃子像，包括王公贵族的像，画像非常多，但是大家都很喜欢，因为他把光的方式改了。
So Giuseppe, after he arrived in China, he realized that the Chinese did not prefer to have shadows. So he began to adapt, and his paintings of the royal families, they were very appreciated because he used less of the shadow that he learned from the Western tradition.
我们看后面一张，这是他画的一个宫廷的那个皇太后的像，他的理解，他很好的运用了，就是中国人对光，就是把他自己学到的用对光的运用，跟中国的平面感的东西结合得很好。他基本上采用的方式是正面来的散射光，散射不是强光，是那种散射的光，正面来的。
So if you look at this painting from Giuseppe, you'll see that he takes it at a front view, and it's a flat view, and it is preferred by the emperors very, very much. And you can see the light is even and very, very faint.
好像我们从前面打的灯光照了一层薄的纱，照到这个人的身上，这种感觉。
As if the lights actually came through a veil, a very light-weighted silk veil.
这样既保存了他自己就是西方人的油画里面的一种塑造，包括肌肉结构等等，又保持了中国人喜欢的那种平面感。
So this is a combination of using the Western techniques and the Chinese or Eastern techniques, keeping the composition very Eastern, but also the structure and everything from the Western perspective.
郎世宁跟其他的几个外国的传道士在中国的画，除了画人物、山水、花鸟，都画得很好，但是都比较像中国的工笔，而不是写意。
So besides Giuseppe, there were other missionaries. They were also in China, and they mostly painted for the palaces. They focused on people, mountains, rivers, birds and flowers, and so on. They did very detailed work, and their work was not free-flowing.
他们在光的运用上面，到后来也影响到了中国的画家。首先影响到的是接触西方比较多的广东的，就是叫做就岭南派，然后影响到了就是海派，就是上海的。
So they started to have some impact on the style of painting to a group south of the mountain we call Lingnan. Also, actually, it's a Pearl River Delta area, and then the impact also went to by the ocean called Shanghai Haipai. That's near Shanghai area.
岭南派呢比较漂亮的颜色，然后有一点点光的感觉。海派呢也就吸收了一点吸收了一些光感，然后把一种光的感觉跟中国传统的画法，包括写意画法结合的蛮好。
So for the Lingnan style, the Pearl River Delta style, they use combination of more light and more colors. And for the Shanghai or Haipai style, they use the light and more traditional style combination and more free-flowing.
我们看看后面的，这个是任伯年的一张人物的画。你看他在那个水墨的中国画的感觉，他用了以后，他在脸和边缘的一些做法上似乎有光的感觉，脸也有起伏感，脸上的起伏感比以前的古人的画起伏感要强一些。
Look at this piece of painting by Ren Bonian. If you look at the ink and the part, that's more traditional. But if you focus on his face, you will see he used the coloring. And the coloring not only represented lighting, but also you could see the curves of his face. So the light color, the darker color shows the curvatures of his face.
像这种水墨写意的画法是西方的传教士在中国的，他们从来没接触过的，也许是比较难学吧。
This the Westerners did not seem to be able to capture. Maybe it is a little difficult because this is the magic of the brush and ink.
那目前西方的一些就是对这种中国画的理解也不太能理解，就是。
And also, most Western artists have some challenge or difficulty in actually comprehending the deeper meaning of a painting such as this one.
我们再看后面上。
Next.
对，这个是岭南派的，好像后面来光，颜色很漂亮。
So this is a typical Lingnan style. The light seems to come from behind, and it's quite beautiful.
这是赵少昂的一张画。
This one was painted by Zhao Shaoang.
对，我们看后面的。对于西方绘画来讲，他们跟中国画离得最远距离的，就是类似于像八大山人这样的绘画。
Actually, I would like to say in contrast, very much in contrast to Western painting, would be something like this, done by Bada Sanren, Chinese style.
他们是用线条，用这种感觉，用笔墨来表现内心世界，跟西方世界表现光、表现客观是完全不同的两类。
This is actually the direct opposite of Western style, which uses objectivity and the light and so on. The Chinese painting is free-flowing with lines, with the darkness and lightness of the ink, and then it actually represents the deeper thoughts inside one's heart.
对，这一类也就是西方的传教士在中国从来没接触到的，没有谁。
So all the past missionaries from the West, they never really could get in touch with this type of painting and this thought process and painting process.
对，我们说西方绘画对中国的影响最大的是从20世纪开始。
So the actual greater impact of Western painting and arts started really in the 20th century.
20世纪，特别是上半世纪，民国时期，那个时候出了很多的大师，因为皇帝没有了，传统的一些约束没有了，西方的文化进来了，西方的绘画的感觉进来了，而且很多人到了西方学画，所以呢，他们就是完全的全面的。全方位的在世界这个角度上审视中国的绘画，所以出现了很多的大师。有的大师呢，完全按照中国绘画的样式有一些突破，比如说齐白石、黄宾虹。有些大师呢，就吸收西方的手法、西方的绘画来改造中国画，比如说傅抱石，他的称法从日本那边学过来，然后。有的呢，就完全吸收一点西方的绘画，受西方绘画的影响，比如说林凤眠，等等，这就是20世纪初期就出现了很多这样的一些大师，它是一个很辉煌的一个时期，很特殊的时期。
Yeah. So the first part of the 20th century, after the last emperor, the beginning of the establishment of the republic, West and East met together, and the artists from China began to really look into Western paintings. Although there were some that mostly kept the Chinese style, including Huang Binhong and Qi Baishi, the others had taken from other countries, Fu Baoshi, for example, learned from Japan, and there were even others such as Lin Fengmian, they took from really the Western art. So I would say that during that first part of the 20th century, artists in China, they flourish and it was really a very brilliant time for the artists.
对，今后中西方文化要相互的融合，中国绘画要走向世界，这是一个很有趣的过程，我们都在经历这个过程，所以很感谢这个讲座来涉及到这一个内容，非常感谢。
So if we look at the integration and the meeting of the East and West, I think this is a very interesting perspective. And so this particular lecture is very good. I'm very thankful that this kind of art exchange can be established.
谢谢大家，谢谢丽丽博士。
谢谢 Thank you so much.